6 children, 1 slice of bread, and a quarter-pint of milk to share between them. In 1829 London, Esther Hibner ran an embroidery business built on the backs of parish apprentices, orphans sold from the workhouse into a life of systematic starvation. But it wasn't just the hunger. When little Frances Colpitts grew too weak to work, her mistress held her by the heels and dipped her into a bucket of water, shouting, "Finish her." Today, in the next 9 minutes, we'll open the forgotten file on the trial that exposed the dark reality of London's orphan slaves. In early 19th century, London was a city of industry, where even the most vulnerable were treated as fuel for the machine. In the district of Camden Town, at a place called Pratt Terrace, Esther Hibner ran an embroidery business that appeared, on the surface, to be a service to the community. She took orphan girls off the hands of the local parish workhouse, promising to teach them a trade and provide for their needs. To the cash-strapped parish, it was a perfect arrangement. It shifted the cost of the children's survival from the public purse to a private employer. But once the girls crossed the threshold of Pratt Terrace, they entered a world where the law effectively ceased to protect them. Under the apprentice laws of the era, these children were treated less like students and more like property. The invisible shield protecting Esther Hibner wasn't her social status. It was a legal system that favored the rights of a master over the basic humanity of a child. Behind the heavy doors of the house in Pratt Terrace, the apprenticeship was actually a slow-motion catastrophe. 6 young girls were forced to labor over fine embroidery from 3:30 in the morning until 11 o'clock at night, every single day. If their needles slowed, the punishment was an hourly lashing. At night, they were given only 4 hours of rest, huddled together on a cold, bare floor under a single, thin blanket. By the time the authorities finally intervened, the girls were described as starving, ragged, and exhausted. 10-year-old Frances Colpitts was in the most critical condition, suffering from severe abscesses on her lungs. But it wasn't just the systemic neglect that threatened her life. It was a specific, cruel ritual. When Frances was too weak to work, the younger Esther Hibner would pick her up by her heels and plunge her headfirst into a bucket of cold water. As the child struggled, the forewoman and Robinson was heard screaming, "Damn her! Dip her again and finish her!" The nightmare at Pratt Terrace might have continued indefinitely if not for a single act of grandmotherly persistence. In January 1829, the grandmother of little Frances Colpitts arrived at the house, hoping to see her granddaughter. She was met at the door by Esther Hibner and her daughter, who turned her away with a chillingly casual excuse. The child had been naughty and was currently barred from seeing visitors. But the grandmother wasn't convinced. She went straight to the parish beadle, the local official responsible for the poor, and voiced her suspicions. When the beadle forced his way into the house to inspect the child, he uncovered a scene that would lead the local headlines to call it disgraceful mistreatment. He found 6 little girls who weren't just being disciplined, they were being systematically destroyed. They were covered in lice, dressed in rags, and so skeletal from exhaustion and hunger that they could barely stand. Frances, the youngest and weakest, was already dying from the abscesses on her lungs. The girls were immediately rushed back to the workhouse and given broth to save them. But for Frances, the intervention came just a few days too late. The evidence presented at the Old Bailey wasn't just a collection of witness statements. It was a mathematical proof of intent to kill. The prosecution focused on the starveling fare, the exact amount of food Esther Hibner provided to the 6 girls. They shared a single quarter-pint of milk and 1 slice of bread each for breakfast. For the entire week, the group of 6 shared only 9 pounds of potatoes. Most shocking was the meat allowance, 1 single slice of meat shared every other Sunday. When the medical examiners took the stand, they confirmed that Frances Colpitts hadn't just died from a sudden illness. She had been systematically hollowed out by hunger. This evidence turned the apprenticeship into something much darker. The court wasn't looking at a business owner who was struggling to provide. They were looking at a woman who had calculated exactly how little a human being needs to stay alive while still being able to hold a needle. The dipping in the water was the final spark, but the starvation was the fuel. The invisible shield protecting Esther Hibner wasn't just her social status. It was the legal structure of the apprentice system itself. Under the law at the time, parishes were essentially allowed to dump orphans into the hands of masters to save on public relief costs, often with zero oversight once the contract was signed. The system created a vacuum where a child like Frances Colpitts could be worked 19.5 hours a day and starved on a starveling fare, while the law looked the other way. The real legal failure was that the parish beadle only intervened after a persistent grandmother raised an alarm, showing that for these children, the system designed to protect them was actually the very thing that trapped them in a house of horrors. The trial at the Old Bailey boiled down to a single, grueling technicality that would decide who lived and who died. The defense made a calculated move. They argued that the dipping, the physical assault that likely pushed the child over the edge, was the work of the daughter and the forewoman, not the mistress herself. They claimed Esther Hibner couldn't be a murderer because she wasn't the one holding the child by her heels over the bucket. This forced the jury into a corner. They had to decide, was it the sudden violence of the dipping or the long-term starvation that actually killed Frances Colpitts? If it was the dipping, the mistress might walk free while her underlings faced the noose. If it was the starvation, the woman at the top would finally be held responsible for the environment she created. In a case where everyone expected the people who physically tortured the child to hang, the law took a different path. The jury reached a verdict that shocked the public. They focused not on the final act of violence, but on the environment that made death inevitable. Esther Hibner, the mistress who had never physically dipped the child herself, was the only one sentenced to death by hanging. Because she was the master of the house, the court held her legally responsible for the systematic starvation that had truly sealed Frances's fate. Her daughter and the forewoman and Robinson, the ones who actually held the child underwater, were spared the gallows. Instead, they were sentenced to transportation, sent away to a penal colony for their role as underlings. The mistress paid the ultimate price because, in the eyes of the law, her neglect was a more powerful weapon than their assault. The conviction of Esther Hibner wasn't just about punishing a cruel employer. It was a watershed moment for the British legal system. For years, the apprentice laws had acted as a shield for masters, allowing them to treat orphans as disposable labor under the guise of teaching them a trade. By sentencing the owner to death for the starvation rather than the physical assault, the court established a powerful precedent, a duty of care. It sent a message to every business owner in London that they could no longer hide behind their staff or ignore the slow destruction of those under their roof. The law finally recognized that systemic neglect, intentionally creating a lethal environment, is just as murderous as a physical blow. The execution of Esther Hibner wasn't just the end of a house of horrors, it was the death of an excuse. For centuries, the powerful had used the law as a wall to distance themselves from the suffering they profited from. But when the trapdoor opened at Newgate Prison, that wall fell with her. It proved that while you can hire someone to do your work, you can never hire someone to carry your conscience. Today, the case stands as a grim reminder that the most dangerous criminals aren't always the ones holding the bucket. Sometimes, they're the ones making sure it stays full.